Hello, hello. Welcome, please come in. The poison runs are done, and all that remains is to go through the details and talk about everything we've been through. This is the third single type only challenge I've done, and I'm always surprised by how different these types feel. What gaps they leave open, what gaps they cover, what the kind of random hodgepodge of Pokemon I get stuck with are capable of. Because that is really the thing that brings everything together. What sort of Pokemon are a particular type? And we'll be starting by going through what the poison type is. So, what does the poison type look like? And the answer is very weird. So poison types are only super effective against two types, grass and fairy. And considering that fairy type didn't exist prior to Gen 6, it's basically only useful at targeting grass types. A type that already has 4 other weaknesses. Oh, and yes, technically in Gen 1 poison was also good against bug types, but I didn't play a Gen 1 game. And also no one should play a Gen 1 game, so that is not relevant. Poison is also bad at dealing neutral damage, being resisted by 4 types, and completely negated by a 5th. So, with its offenses being trash, you might expect its defenses to be better, but they're still not exceptional. Poison types do resist grass, fighting, and fairy, which are common or otherwise strong types, so that's pretty nice to have. However, being weak to the very good ground type is not ideal, and being weak to psychic, which often has very fast special attackers, is also bad. Another nice benefit of poison types is they are, as you might expect, completely immune to the poison status effect. Most of the time. And they are very good at dealing it. A very nice number of poison types moves always inflict poison, have a chance to inflict poison, or benefit from a Pokemon being afflicted with poison. The very good spread of Toxic Spikes, and Venoshock means that you can actually get a good chunk of damage out very, very quickly. There are also a decent diversity in stat spreads across poison types. You have bulky tank Pokemon, special attackers, and physical attackers. It's easy to take that stat diversity for granted, but having completed a normal-only run, which is a type that has almost no special attackers, it's a huge boon against some of the strong physical walls you can run into. And while poison itself isn't a great attacking type, there are a decent number of poison Pokemon with surprisingly deep move pools. This does a lot to help cover the frankly awful offensive matchups that poison often has to deal with. And that is the poison type. So now we'll hop into the actual comparisons between the games. And we start with our first game, FireRed, and we start with our first point of comparison, difficulty. And FireRed gets to slide right into the center of this comparison. FireRed is delightfully mid in the difficulty. The first thing keeping it from being overly difficult is the sheer number of Pokemon you can use. Gen 1, and by extension the Gen 3 remakes, were very generous with how many poison types they introduced. I didn't actually look it up, but my assumption is more poison types were introduced in Gen 1 than any other generation. And they are incredibly varied. From the bulky Muck to the fast special attacking Gengar, this huge number is basically the whole reason I decided to prioritize primary poison types in this series. Otherwise, there would be no reason not to select some of the strongest Pokemon that you could ever hope to use. Among the Pokemon I did use, Nidoqueen and Nidoking stand out pretty solidly above the rest. These poison ground Pokemon are just so good, possessing strong offenses, decent defenses, and a frankly comically varied move pool. Between just these two Pokemon, I probably had an offensive move to target every single type in the game. And Crobat, being very fast and immune to ground-type attacks, meant these 3 Pokemon really did a lot to carry me through this run. Crobat is a Pokemon I've always liked, and my opinion of it has only improved. I do love a fast-attacking Pokemon. But it was still a challenging run in certain places. One big issue was lack of type diversity. Because I was focusing on primary poison types, I only managed to have 3 types: Poison, Poison Ground, and Poison Flying. Among other things, this meant I had nothing to deal with Psychic-type Pokemon. And Psychic-type Pokemon are pretty strong in Gen 1, often having very high speed and special attack. This gen was also before the physical special split, so all my Pokemon were physical attackers, limiting my offense against Pokemon with low special defense. I mean, I did make Nidoqueen a special attacker, but that was more out of necessity rather than an actually good special attack stat. This strategy did work, but I did have to do a lot more work to make sure my poison types could take advantage of their diverse move pools. And then Platinum gets to slide right into the hardest game on the list, which it basically always does. Honestly, a big part of this is just because Platinum is a much harder game than the other two, probably one of the hardest Pokemon games period, and the first issue is that I couldn't catch any primary poison types other than Zubat prior to the first gym. The first gym actually forced me to change the rules of the challenge because I absolutely needed something to add to my team just to properly get the run started. And then the game was mostly pretty smooth, right up until the final Cyrus fight. And this fight is always a pain. It was definitely difficult in a different way than Bug Only, but Cyrus is a very strong trainer, and he has a full team. In retrospect, considering this game's difficulty, I probably should have just bit the bullet and added a 6th team member. This was the only game where I only had 5 Pokemon, and that could have impacted its difficulty ranking. Oh, right, Cynthia, no, this was always going to be the most difficult. The other trainers in this generation just have so much more diversity. Even the gym leaders, who are stuck using only one Pokemon type, generally have very diverse move pools to deal with Pokemon that might otherwise be super effective against them. And of course, the Elite Four, which has both a Ground and Psychic type specialist. My type diversity was a bit better, having 4 different type combos instead of 3. And the best combo, Poison Dark, was present in 2 of my Pokemon, which was incredible to have for defensive purposes. The type combo is only weak to ground type attacks, and it is one of my favorites. And while Crobat isn't even remotely tanky, it does have one defensive benefit in that it is immune to the ground type attacks that are otherwise super effective against my entire team. This was a big boon in helping cover all my weaknesses, and I don't think I'll ever recover from getting walled by a Pachirisu and a Wurmple. And finally, we reach Pokemon Violet, which gets to slot into the easiest slot, which it basically always does. A part of that is that Violet is not an especially difficult game. Another part is that the single-type only run starts to strain at how many Pokemon there are in this game. I mean, I had a wide selection of what poison types I wanted to use, particularly once I included the 2 DLCs. While I didn't really use most of the Pokemon, Alolan Muck was definitely an MVP with its very good typing and frankly criminal moveset. Muck was so good most of the time that I got a little bit obsessed with Minimize Acid Armor strats. There were definitely a decent number of points where I should have leaned more into Salazzle's high speed and high special attack, especially once it got nasty plot. At more than a few points, Clodsire was set to die in 2 turns and could have very easily set up with Yawn in perfect sequence to send in Salazzle right as the opponent fell asleep, which would have given plenty of time to set up and then sweep some of the trainers that ended up being difficult, like Geeta. But even the hardest trainers in this game weren't too difficult. Trainers that I fought really sloppily, like Rhyme or Brassius, were still first tries. I'm trying to remember how many trainers I actually had to fight multiple times. Kofu? Geeta? Is that it? And I think both of those were 2-shots. So not only was this game the easiest in the series, I think this is the easiest run in any of my Pokemon series. I think a part of that is that Poison really is the best of the 3 types I've thus far done. I'm sure future single-type series will be easier, but for now at least, I'm comfortable saying this has been the easiest overall. And it's time to go through the recommendation section, where I must examine and announce the order I would recommend these runs in. And I will preface this by saying that, honestly, I would recommend any of these runs. I think Poison-type only runs are pretty interesting, and all of these would reach the echelons of go for it. But we must appease the formula, and we must start with FireRed, as is tradition. And this game gets to add a recommendation to its long list of delightfully mid achievements. Because middle is where it goes. This was the first playthrough I've ever done with a focus on poison types. And a big part of that is because I'm not a big fan of the poison type. I don't tend to prioritize status type moves, which poison types obviously do. And when choosing Pokemon, and the type of Pokemon I want, I tend to prioritize offensive coverage, and Poison has, frankly, none of that. Being super effective against Fairy is nice, but Steel is right there, and is just so much better in every way. And while grass types are common, so are grass types' better weaknesses in the form of fire and flying. And bug, I guess. So the poison type ends up feeling awkward. The best 2 Pokemon I used in FireRed were as useful as they were specifically because they had plenty of non-poison type moves to use. The other issue I have with recommending this game is it's before the physical special split. I really struggle to recommend any Pokemon game prior to Gen 4, because the split of moves feels like a fundamental aspect of Pokemon play at this point, and having all moves be special or physical based solely on their type feels bad. It also limits the efficacy of Pokemon whose types and stat distributions do not align. Well, not specifically relevant here, Gengar is a good example where it is a fast special attacker, but both of its types are physical. Gen 4 Split just does so much to expand what Pokemon can be good, and what Pokemon can exist. So really, any games prior to that always gets points taken off, even if the game is otherwise well designed. I just can't cope without my split damage types. Hello Gen 4, just who I was talking endlessly about. You can slide right into last place, because I would definitely recommend this run to anyone interested, but I would recommend the other runs first. And there are a couple of reasons for this, and the first is the difficulty. As I talked about above, Platinum do be hard. Even in a normal run with a diverse team, there are a few fights that do not mess around. Cyrus, Cynthia, even the last berry fight can be a bit tricky. And yeah, it's not super difficult, this is a game for children, but that higher level of difficulty becomes amplified in a restricted run like this. The second big factor is the smaller pool of primary poison types to choose from. It really hinders the variety of tactics you can make use of, or even access. I had to cheat in a Stunky and add a Budyu to the team just to get through some sections. Without those, I'd only have 3 Pokemon, and that is just not enough to get through a game this hard. At least not with a level cap in place. And yes, I'm sure people better and smarter at Pokemon probably could, but I've never claimed or pretended to be great at this game. I just play them because they do be fun. While I am implicitly explaining my recommendation of this exact run, I would probably rank this game higher if you wanted to be a little looser with the poison restriction. There are other non-primary poison types in the game that could do a lot to expand the roster and improve what moves and strategies you could employ, particularly against the hardest trainers this game has to offer. So Platinum does stay in last place, but it's not a bad run, and it's not too far off from a good run. And then there was Violet, and it goes into the highest slot. What can I say? I really like Scarlet and Violet. They just do a lot of fun things to make playing them easier. They have a huge pool of usable Pokemon. There were a bunch of poison types I just never bothered to pick up because I wasn't actually planning on using them. It also has the option to easily relearn the moves a Pokemon previously knew and have since replaced. This does a lot to make customizing your Pokemon for each major trainer fight way easier. It is a bit of a bummer that you have to make TMs with Pokemon parts. Don't get me wrong, I think the mechanic is actually good in an open world game, it just makes the challenge run a bit more tedious. Plus, if I had some way to mod in rare candies so I didn't have to grind out Chansey and Blissey, that would be fantastic. I'd also probably accidentally overlevel less frequently. This game also has a much more streamlined experience than prior games. Because they split the story into 3 different paths, you can actually treat the game as more of a boss rush. No more getting interrupted by random evil teams or legendary nonsense. Looking at you, Pokemon Black and White. I mean, it does actually still take more time to record these runs than those on the DS or GBA, mostly because I can't use any sort of speed-up option. But there's a lot less fluff I have to get through, so I think it's worth it. Violet also benefits from being the latest gen, which means the many Pokemon I do have access to mostly have the widest move pool they ever have. So it is pretty rare to not be able to get a decent moveset together. This is not always the case in prior games. Heck, my Toxicroak in Platinum had Nasty Plot for like 10 levels when it didn't even know a special move because I wasn't learning any usable moves to replace it with. So it's just a nice boon to have the most available options. It really bums me out that the performance on these games is absolute garbage. Oh well, nothing I can do about that. And that is that. Another set of runs completed, another series done. I did want to shout out that I do have a Patreon, linked in the description. I spend a lot of time making these videos, so if you enjoyed the video, want to support the channel, and are financially stable enough to do so, that exists. No pressure though, this channel is free to enjoy for everyone, and will remain that way. For now, if you like this video, be sure to hit the like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey, maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.